All aboard the Starmer Express. Anyone? Keir is here with a Labour pledge to renationalise the railways within 5 years if they win the next election. Under its blueprint, a new body called Great British Railways, which would take over service contracts currently held by private firms as they expire in the coming years. So your commute might sound something like this.
This is a Starmer Express service to renationalisation, calling at £2 billion a year savings, automatic delay and cancellation refunds, digital season tickets, integrated timetables and better internet. Please keep your belongings with you and enjoy your journey. Could customers please be advised that the pay dispute with striking train drivers is ongoing.
Sounds a bit like the Johnny Cab, doesn't it, from that old Arnold Schwarzenegger film? Anyway, oh yes, that old chestnut. How the party, of the trade unions will handle the rail unions is still up for debate. Joining me now is transport journalist Dan Harvey. Dan, very good evening to you. Welcome to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. It all sounds great, doesn't it? Like the whole idea of the train system that we currently have all sounds great until you actually try and get on one. So how realistic do you think this is actually going to be for Labour?
I think it's a common sense idea. When you remember that actually at the moment the railways are partly nationalised, you've got these train operators that are running trains under really strict prescriptive contracts with the government, where basically the government is telling them what to do and they're not really adding very much value to the whole operation, but they're getting a fee to run our train services.
Yeah. Well, they're getting quite a hefty fee, aren't they? I mean, they're all making loads and loads of money, the people running the train services. They're not running very well. They're not sorting out the striking workers very cleverly. And in the end, I'm afraid, they've also got the Network Rail problem, haven't they? So what are Labour going to do about that? Because one of the things that people say to me is the issue is that you've got Network Rail that sort of own the track, and you've got all these different train companies that rent the track off them and run trains or not on somebody else's track.
This is it. I mean, a railway consists of the track and the trains running together, and one without the other isn't really much use to anybody.
Yeah.
So if you've got any sort of division between the two, where they're kind of having to liaise with each other and they're having to make sure that they're meeting different contract terms, then that's creating a difficulty which doesn't need to exist. So I think, the existing government has realised that bringing together the trains and the track, actually, it's the only way that you can get the system to work. And what Starmer's said, what the Labour Party are planning to do is really just to push this forward a bit and say, yeah, well, actually, we don't need to have private train operators. We can bring the whole thing together. We can run it as a single unit, track and train together, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense, really.
But the thing that most people, I suppose, would care about who travel by train, and not that many people do anymore, unfortunately, is will it make this travelling on trains any cheaper? Because it's got quite expensive over the years.
Well, it is. I mean, it's hugely expensive, and the amount of money that has to go in to prop up the system is vast when you start picking away at it. I think you shouldn't be under any illusion that the plans that have been announced by Labour aren't going to suddenly mean the cost of travelling plummets. There's a lot of work to do to streamline the system, to reduce these costs, to get it running more efficiently. And actually, those savings aren't going to be seen for years to come. So they're doing the right thing, but it's going to take time for the benefits to show.
Yeah, how long do you think, though? Because I remember when nationalisation was a big thing back in the 70s, the trains were pretty awful then under nationalisation. So what will they do to change that? How will they make that different?
Well, I don't think an awful lot is going to change. I think the existing operations, as the contracts expire, they will be brought back under government control. But the people actually running the system isn't going to change very much. But what it will do is it will get rid of this fee that you have to pay a company if you're asking a company to do anything for you, even if they're just in name running the railway. And it will also get rid of this clunky interface where there's a contract, and therefore if anyone breaks some sort of term in the contract, you've got to bring the lawyers in. So by getting rid of that, train tracks, they can work directly with each other without worrying about upsetting anyone. And in time, that should start to take out costs. It should start to make the whole thing much more efficient. But I don't think we're going to see a return to the sort of old nationalised days where British Rail was much maligned, and there was the sort of British Rail sandwich that became the stuff of legend.
Yeah.
I think the actual standard, that's not going to change. You're still going to have the standard we've got today, and hopefully, if Labour go about it in the right way, they'll be able to improve things.
OK. Dan, thanks very much indeed. Dan Harvey there with an update on how they're not going to change anything. They're just going to hope that it gets better by the sounds of it. But you never know. You could well be onto something there. Let's bring in my panel. Comedian commentator Steve N. Allen is here. Communications Officer, Institute of Economic Affairs, Reem Ibrahim. Good to see you. And broadcaster Sam Dowler. Welcome to all of you. Now, I don't know how many of you use the train on a regular basis, but all I know from people who use the train on a regular basis is that they never know when the train's going to come. If it does come, you don't know how many carriages it's going to have. Don't know whether you're going to be able to get on it. It's going to be crammed and rammed. You're going to have your face up against somebody else's face if they're not on strike.
But this is why it's a good time to do this. Like, there's
Yeah.
never
What,
been a...
though? I mean,
no,
it sounds like
there's
they're
never
gonna
been a
think
better
about
it.
time.
What he's saying.
Because you literally couldn't make it worse.
Yeah.
If you take over the train system
All
now...
you say that.
Well, I
That's
do
not
say
true.
that.
So if you speak to anybody before the 90s that used the train service,
I'm one of
they
them.
will be able to tell you that it was much worse.
Yeah, but there's no guarantee
before
that it
the
will go back
90s.
to the same, because
And-
all of the complaints about what could happen are already happening. All of the upshot of having a competitive market don't seem to be there.
Well,
so
is
we already don't get the place.
it currently a competitive market is the question. The government are picking and choosing which companies get each leg, and effectively you've got to do a lot to not
Yes.
get that contract if you're the incumbent. If you fail, let's talk about what a market is. A market allows for competition and choice. As passengers, do we have a choice
No.
about what company we go with
No, you
from
don't.
London to Manchester? No, the government chooses for you. These are not the aspects of a market that we
That's why
actually
there's no
want.
point privatising something into no market. The same,
Also-
same's true of water as well. If you can't actually have competition, you won't get efficiencies, no
But you
no
can
saving.
have competition.
Yeah.
And actually, what
but
we
the
have
point
to
is, the
do-
trouble is, though, there is not only is there not any competition, but it's also not really privatised, because it's massively,
not privatised.
massively
It's
subsidised by taxpayers' money, and we give loads of money to these train companies who don't do the job very well, and who
Yeah.
and
And then
so
they
go and
keep
buy
the
new villas in
contracts.
Florida.
But if we're funding a failing system, wouldn't it be nicer if we owned the failing system rather than
No.
someone else?
Well, no, it's
putting
clearly-
money up
it's
on top?
clearly
Why do you
time-
think the government are going to be better at doing it than private companies?
Well,
It's,
the
clear, it's,
ones
clearly
have already
time for, it's
failed.
clearly time for a change. It doesn't work. I rely on the
Yeah,
train.
let's hear some examples of how bad
okay,
it is.
I come from Hertfordshire,
Yeah.
and I rely on the train. I can't just drive into central
Right.
London. I rely on.
So
the
are you
train.
on a main line?
Yes, on a main line.
Right.
Yeah,
Thames
and it's for yes on Thames Link. No, not Thames Link actually.
I'm Thames.
No, great. Well, you said no.
look at you
We'll talk
showing
about that
off.
after. What I'm saying
So
is
you
that
don't even know what line. You don't even know what line it is.
It's
Don't even
no
want
to
to
get
post on
no
one
to get
where you
to
are.
get
You share
a
a car.
to get a ticket and a zone and a
Right.
zone 1 to 6 cost me £25.
Right.
And like so, for example, my
Is that
friends,
return?
No, family. Yeah, return.
Right.
Family of mine came over from Australia, and like anyone who comes to the UK sees that price, and they're so appalled about how expensive it is. And yet, so I also have family in Devon, and they go, "Oh, use the trains, use the
Yeah.
trains," and it's at least £200 for me to get down to Devon and back.
Yeah.
Where in the car it cost me maybe 50.
Yeah,
So
especially
I mean,
if there's more than, if there's 2 or 3 of you.
Of course, it's
cheaper
ridiculous.
to not-
Exactly,
But this
like-
is why, when they strike now, the main body of use of the trains is at the weekends, because most people now don't commute by train, either because they don't go to work anymore because they work from home, or just because it's become too expensive.
Yeah.
And they found other ways to get in.
And they're not reliable. And that's
No.
fine if it makes you late for some personal thing, but if
Right.
it impacts your career, it's very difficult
Right.
to be booked for work
But
and
no,
then
if
try and
you
get
well,
trained.
also if you're trying to get to a hospital appointment or something like that, and the train suddenly gets cancelled, it's horrendous.
And we know that if you miss an NHS appointment, you're not going to get another one for another 6,
But
7,
also,
8
No.
but
months,
also
maybe even a
I've
year.
relied on the train to get to live television like we're on now, and as simple, even like 15-minute or like a cancellation, that means you're not there on time.
Right.
You do miss your work, and
there's
like
a lot
you
of
have an empty
cancellations.
chair here.
I mean, I've seen, mostly I don't use the trains. In fact, I stopped using the train to go down to Sussex and bought a car because it was so unreliable. And that was years ago, right? But also the underground now, you see an awful lot of stations shutting. I drove home the other day past Bermondsey Station and it was 10 o'clock at night and it was shut. And it had a sign up saying, shut due to staff shortages, which
Well,
means
no,
basically
no.
nobody's turned up
And
for
that's
work.
the-
can't run the
TfL.
train because we don't have the staff to get
Right.
on the train. That's what we
But
have.
This is TfL, which is, again, wholly owned by the government, and that's primarily Sadiq Khan's fault.
Yeah.
Right?
The two does run pretty well, though, if you're going to make a comparison.
It does run well
We've seen
compared.
over the last few years, Sadiq Khan has bankrupted TfL not once, not twice, but 3 times post-pandemic. So I think it's really
But he's
interesting.
also found loads of money to keep him going, though, hasn't he? That's the other
Our
thing.
money that we're paying towards.
Yeah, no, I get that.
tubes
But what I'm
is
saying is
hugely
the tube is
expensive.
not a great example of a system that doesn't
No.
work.
And
It
in-
works better than the rail.
It works actually really well.
But also, in defence of the people who don't turn up to their jobs on the tube, they were probably stuck on a train.
Possibly.
They would have been there if any of these trains actually ran.
Yeah, well, of course, if I was running it, I'd say you can't live outside of London if you work on TfL because we're not going to pay for you to come in. We're not going to pay for you to work while you're commuting, which is what they currently do. It's an absolute racket.
It's
the
your
way
sales
they do it.
pitch for
Exactly, and I have friends. I have friends that live in.
I do it for less than 750,000 a year as well.
I have friends that live in Margate, which is only
Very trendy now, Margate.
Yes, obviously trendy.
Very
friends,
trendy.
friends of mine.
I had a friend that moved there before it was trendy.
Of course you do.
Yeah.
Well, my friends are far more trendy.
I'm sure they are.
But however, they have jobs in London, and
Yeah.
like it costs maybe like £10,000, £15,000
Don't move to Margate if you work in
but
London.
you can't.
you
But
know.
you can't commute. That's absolutely outrageous to spend that amount of money.
Yeah, but think
That's
about the
more than
amount how
childcare
expensive
sometimes.
house prices are in
Yes.
London. It's pushing people out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but that's always
exactly.
been the case. People used to move to Tunbridge Wells and they'd take into account the amount of money they would have to pay for a season ticket and the cheaperness of the cheaper housing that they could buy, and they'd factor it all in so you can make a decision as to whether it's better to have a more expensive property in London and not pay for a commuter thing. But I was in America not that long ago, and there's a train you can take from Connecticut into New York, which takes about 2 and a bit hours.
I've done that train, it's great.
Yeah, and it's Amtrak.
Yeah.
And I think it's subsidised to an extent. It's only about $20, you know, and you're on a train for like 2.5 hours. I mean, here it would be literally 200.
Yeah.
It's the classic thing that we
So-
invent something and then just leave it at that. And
Right.
other nations get to do it as a second phase or third phase.
Right.
That's why other people's trains run better.
But
You can
equally,
also look at Japan, for example, about actual automatic trains. Like the fact that we don't have that in London, and it's supposed to be one of the most international cities in the world.
We're doing the
I think
DLR
it's
actually.
DLR,
That's
yeah.
true.
They're
The DLR.
automatic.
The DLR is one line out of how many? I think we.
I had a
do
friend of
better
mine who
than
used to
that.
sit on the DLR and pretend to be driving it. And people
We've all
would
done
actually
that.
think he was the driver, you know, because
I
they
do
would
that
know.
on
Did
top
he
of
wear the outfit?
Yeah, you know, he used
Did
to wear a hat and he would
like
sit
a
in the
crazy
front.
person?
And he would sit in the front and the tourists would all think he was actually
That's
driving the train.
amazing.
Very funny. But, you know, every other place you go, like France, they talk about the trains being great. It's all very heavily subsidised, but so is ours.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why ours
Why is
is
ours the
so
worst
crap.
of everybody?
And what about, we haven't even
not-
mentioned
it's not
HS2
worse.
yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that. What?
Well,
I mean,
Again,
is that
government-
ever...
this is
I'm going to die before they finish that.
HS2 is a perfect example of governments making risky decisions with our money, by the way.
Yeah.
This is taxpayer money being spent on it,
Yeah.
and entirely failing as a result. We've seen the different legs be cancelled. The leg
Yeah.
between Birmingham and Manchester was cancelled,
Yeah.
which basically renders HS2 useless.
Exactly.
And I actually think
It's not
what's
so much of a
interesting about
Y
this-
shape now, it's
how-
just an I, isn't it?
But how can we look at examples like HS2 and then think, you know what the solution is? I want the government to take over all of it. I
Yeah,
mean, that's
I
clearly
know.
not the right thing to do.
And the problem as well that people tell me with HS2 is that all the contractors are charging them the earth. You know, they just think of a number, double it, and then double it again, and just put it into the government, and somebody will sign it, and you'll get paid. You know,
We should have been developing infrastructure all along. The problem with HS2 is that it was sold as all about being about the speed.
Yeah.
It's not. It's about capacity. Get big, fast trains doing the big journeys on
Yeah.
one track, and then you can have more of the smaller trains doing the shorter journeys. We will fail to have that, so we get none
Right.
of either good worlds
Yes.
there. But because we left it too late, instead of developing infrastructure all along,
Right.
as the country grew, as we needed it, we just wait and go, no, let's make some
yeah.
massive
I
plan.
mean, I
It'll
must
cost us
admit,
billions.
as I say, I don't often do it, but if I do travel on the train, if it does work, it is quite a good way to travel, you know, as long as it goes to the place you're going to, you know, but the trouble is it doesn't. Manchester City and Manchester United are going to play each other in the FA Cup final sometime in May, right? Now, they haven't yet decided when the kickoff is, but if the kickoff is a late kickoff at, say, 5 o'clock, which it might be, because the BBC have got some other sporting
trains
event
are going to
at 3, the last train to Manchester is at 8 o'clock. So if it goes to penalties, nobody's going to get the train. Then you're kind of going, it's a Saturday night. There's and nobody ever says, well, why don't we just put some extra trains on?
No, it's the same thing with, absolutely not quite the same thing, but the same thing with Brighton Pride.
Yeah.
They did that last year.
Yeah, I heard about that.
So many trains
Nobody
backwards
could
and
get
forwards.
on.
And because they decided to have the strike that day,
Yeah.
when there's sometimes Brighton Pride has up to 1 million people.
Yeah.
And
this is the
it's
problem.
almost
This is the problem
impossible.
with
Same with
effective
Glastonbury.
Why aren't you working with us, the
Right.
people?
Yeah.
But this is the problem with franchising the railways and the current system that we have. What incentive does Avanti West Coast have to add additional trains in the evening? What incentive do private companies have? Because they're not going to make any
Well,
more
there'll be
money
people
from
on them
it.
for a start paying. wouldn't
No,
there?
but this is the point. We have actually seen over the last few years an increase in capacity, an increase in the amount of passengers that use the train.
Yeah.
But what incentive does a private company have to actually increase or improve the service? They're not gaining anything from it. And this is the problem with governments handing out contracts. Governments are making the choices, not us. And the whole point of a market economy is that consumers make choices.
Yeah.
This is not an example of that.
But that's the trouble. Almost everything that's been privatised in this country has been badly privatised and has still left us with a massive
A
bill
lot
to
of it
pay.
has to do with the privatisation process. So Thames Water, you mentioned water, is a really good example of that. What often
Yeah, that's going
happens
really well, isn't it?
Is, well,
Thames
exactly.
Water, brilliant.
Well, what often
Terrible.
happens is
Water.
as these companies are public.
This has come straight from Thames Water.
It's lovely and clear.
That's fresh water from Thames Water, that is.
Thames Water. So what happens is the regulations that are effectively moulded for Thames Water means that when they're privatised, they become a public monopoly. Private monopoly. So they're a public monopoly, they become a private monopoly. So governments effectively are saying, you know what, you're going to have the majority of business in this market area. What we actually need is choice and competition. And often these regulations allow incumbents like Thames Water to stay as successful as
But
they
let's
are.
listen to Mr. Dan Harvey, who was just on, and he seemed quite positive that it was the right way to go.
He knows his stuff, that guy, as well.
He does, and he
Trains
was.
need tracks.
Well, he said nothing would change.
And railway trains.
He said things are going to change, and I was
Strange, I like it.
I was into
See
that.
So I'm going to try this Thames Water and see if I don't die.
Oh no, Mike!
Oh, that's
no.
disgusting.